Hello everybody, Crimson here with another think piece video to get you through the content drought. And today we're talking about resistances, and our goal today is to make this man's job easier. If you're unfamiliar with who this guy is, this handsome fellow is Zaki. And Zaki is a game designer at GGG. And Zaki's the GOAT, okay? This is a very pro Zaki video today. His crown is a little askew, let me fix that. And so our goal is to make Zaki's job easier because we love Zaki. Zaki's the best. Zaki's job is to balance monsters and combat at GGG. At least that's how he summarized it when he was interviewed recently. And I'll link that interview in the description down below. But Zaki's job is really hard, and that's because of some core systems in Path of Exile 2, including the way that resistances are implemented, and in fact, defenses in general. And so I want to explain what the problem is, and I want to talk about how we can make Zaki's job easier so that way you guys can have more fulfilling fights because Zaki is able to balance them better. So let's talk about resistances for a second, and I want you guys to think about all of the tools that would be available to you to solve your resistances. You know, resistance rings like a topaz ring, resistance runes like a storm rune, and resistance charms like a topaz charm. And then I want to go through a question at a really basic level that Zaki might encounter, and I want you guys to think about your solution. So I encourage you to literally pause the video and answer this question as I ask it before I work through the example. Let's talk about the campaign fight at the end of Act 2 against Jamunra, where the typical player on League Start might have 500 total HP, or HP and ES combined. Let's assume that there are some players who get really, really lucky with their item drops, or who itemize well, or who trade for strong items, and they have 75% lightning resistance. Let's assume that there are some players who get extremely unlucky, or don't know the game system super well, and have 0% resistance, and there are some players in between who have good or bad RNG and get 50 and 25 respectively. You need to sit down, and you need to decide how much damage one of Jamunra's biggest attacks should do. How do you balance this fight? So suppose that your goal is that the player who has really, really great RNG, or really, really great items that they've traded for or crafted, has a substantive advantage, but the fight is still engaging and dynamic, and the player in the horrible RNG circumstance still has some chance of surviving. That's our goal. We want it to feel substantive and impactful. We want item RNG to be impactful, but we don't want it to be the case that it's so impactful that it completely negates the relevance of player's skill, especially not as early as the end of Act 2. Can we do that? Well, let's just think for a second. My initial guess, if you think about this problem, is that I might guess that you want one of Jamunra's biggest attacks to deal, say, 80% of the horrible defenses player's HP pool. So that would be 400 lightning damage. Well, how much does that do against the player who has great defense? If it's 400 against this guy? Well, that means that against this player, that would deal 100 damage. And against this player, it would deal 200 damage. And against this player, it would deal 300 damage. And of course, against this player, it would deal 400 damage. My question for you is, if the player has 500 max HP, that's probably a big threatening hit for the two players at the bottom, and there's a substantive advantage to having bad instead of horrible defenses here. But the good defensive player is completely not under any threat, and the great defensive player could turn their monitor off and win the fight anyways by just holding down auto attack against the boss and pressing flask every 10 seconds. So it's really hard to do that, and that's because the effective HP difference between tiny amounts of changes in resistance is extremely large. And to show you what I mean by that, what's the hit that it would take to kill one of these players? So for example, what is the lightning damage max hit of a player with each of these resistances if they have 500 total hit pool? Well, the EHP of this player is 2,000, and the EHP of this player is 500. And that means that right now, there's a 4x gap between these two players. And that means that because this number is just so large, I simply cannot create a case where that great defense player will be threatened and that horrible defense player will have any chance at all. And that's not good balance. It means that the fight can't be balanced because extremely small differences in item RNG make extremely huge differences in player outcomes. So let's just talk about how big of a difference some amount of resistance makes. And so we can talk about the elemental max hit as a function of your resistance percentage. So just to give you some idea, if you had 100 base HP and you had 0 resistance, your elemental max hit would be 100. Suppose that we wanted to get another 100 effective HP. How much resistance would we need to get? Well, in order to get to 200 elemental max hit, we would need to get to 50 resistance in order to have this point occur. But if we wanted to get another, we would need to get only to this point to get another 100 elemental max hit, which is 66.666% resistance. And to get another 100%, we would only need to get to 75%, which means this span is 50 points, and this span is 16 2/3 points, and this span is 8 1/3 point. And then we've hit the soft cap in PoE2, which means that a point of resistance is not equal to 1 point of resistance, or to quote LeBron James,
2 points is 2 points, but is there any more joy from making a turnaround jump shot, making a layup?
2 points ain't 2 points.
2 points ain't 2 points. And that's because there's an extremely unequal amount of contribution to your elemental max hit from gaining a point of resistance. It depends on the amount that you already have. To show you what I mean, I made a graph for you, where I can show you how much percentage gain in your EHP you have as a consequence of gaining the next point in resistance percentage. So here you can see that at the absolute beginning, you gain about 1%. And over here in the middle, you start to gain around 2%. And over here at the end, you gain about 4%. And if we zoom out on this, you can see that that means that these 2 points are not at all equal to, say, these 2 points, or equal to these 2 points. And so you end up with a case where 2 points is not 2 points. And this is especially confusing when you consider that the difference in elemental max hit between, say, these 9 points is equal to the elemental max hit contribution of these 50 points. Not a very good system. If we zoom out all the way to PoE2's hard cap, by the way, the problem gets even more extreme, where you can see that, like, the last point to get all the way to the hard cap is nearly 6.5 times as valuable as one of these beginning points over here. What would happen if PoE2 had no cap, by the way? The answer is that this last point, to get from 98 to 99 resistance, would be 100%, 100 times as potent as these beginning points. So the problem gets more extreme the deeper we get into the system, and that means that tiny changes in, like, your mapping resistance, if you get into maps and you go, oh, I've got 66% resistance, I'm probably fine. I still need to get to that cap, but it's not a big difference. That's actually an enormous difference in your elemental max hit, which is a problem, because it means that, like, really small differences in player RNG or in player itemization choices are really bad. So the way that PoE2 has solved this is to make the campaign extremely easy and make maps just assume that you have the cap and punish you really badly if that's not the case, which I think is a problem. So I have a solution to propose, but first I want to work through a sort of baby version of my system before we get to it. Right now, resistances are impossible to balance. Zaki literally cannot make this player remain engaged and this player have any chance at all because their EHP is so different. And that's because resistance percentages stack additively right now, which results in enormous differences in their effective max hit. What would happen if they stacked with multiplicative diminishing returns? So for example, right now, the current system is that we sum your resistances. So we take resistance A and resistance B, we add them together. And we could instead multiply them, where this big pi product means that we're taking resistance alpha and resistance beta, and we're multiplying them. So just to show you the example here, in the summed case, you might expect a player late in the campaign to have access to a couple of tools to deal with lightning damage, you know, a couple of rings or some on-item resistances or some runes, and that means that when we take this plus this plus this, our resistance ends up being, say, 60%. But if we take this and we look at the amount of lightning damage reduction percentage that we could get, this would multiply our max hit. This would multiply our incoming damage by a factor of 0.85. And so would this, and this would multiply this by a factor of 0.9. And that means that our lightning resistance in this particular case would be, very roughly speaking, around 35%, because these three numbers multiplied equals 0.65, which means that our lightning damage resistance percentage is 35%. So the incremental gain from each item is approximately equal, whereas putting this ring on and then this ring on gives unequal amounts because they stack additively, whereas removing this ring or this ring gives the same amount of advantage. And that means that if you take small multiplicative gains in damage reduction, those small multiplicative gains can simultaneously give a substantive advantage to a player, where you can get, say, 20 to 30% multiplicative gain in your lightning damage resistance, and therefore gain in your max hit. And that means that if you have, in the previous example, the bear's base HP is 500, and then they have someone who has nothing, and their max hit is 500, and another player who has one item, and they get 1.2x multiplier, and their max hit survivable is 600, and this person has two multipliers, and their max hit is 720, and so on. And so I can take a hit that would deal, say, 400 to this player, a big, threatening, probably lethal hit, and make it still be something that you have a really good chance of surviving on this max hit and survivability, while still being threatening and requiring you to stay engaged, to press your flask, to pay attention, because these small multiplicative gains in your elemental max hit, while still giving a substantive advantage, are not large enough and don't create a large enough disparity for you to be able to just turn your monitor off and still win during the campaign. It also gives Zaki a better opportunity, and the rest of the balance and design team at GGG, an opportunity to tune the campaign to decide how hard it should be. Right now, if the player base said that something is too hard, the gap between the best and worst case players means that if they nerf things such that players who get worse item outcomes, or players who have lower game knowledge, or players who are playing SSF and therefore have fewer resources available, if they nerf it to make it possible for those players, it's completely trivial for the softcore trade player. And that means that they just can't decide how hard it should be. The difference and the impact of items, as opposed to player skill and game knowledge, is just simply too large. So this is one idea. You can stack things multiplicatively, but what I actually want is a slightly more mathematically complicated system. So if you look again at these effective HP graphs that we made up here, you'll notice that they have an upward sloping curve. So what I mean is, like, this curves up and this curves up, okay? What that means is that there are no diminishing returns to stacking more and more lightning resistance. It may require more and more investment, especially once you hit the soft cap and want to go over to the hard cap, but they're actually accelerating returns, not diminishing returns. And that means that in order to prevent players from just stacking it infinitely, you need to cap it, and caps reduce player agency. If I know that I, for example, struggle defensively, I can't do anything to go beyond the hard cap. If I'm a player who has a weaker weapon and therefore needs to survive the fight for longer, I can't do anything. I have less agency in deciding my build, and defensive choices are less interesting, because reaching the cap in the ultra endgame is pretty trivial once you have Essence and Abyss crafting online. And that means that I never get to ask the choice, how much do I want to add to my survivability through this basic resistance system? Yes, there are other tools, like, for example, you can take physical damage as fire damage, or you can take fire damage as physical damage. You can convert incoming damage types and survive that way. Yes, you can overcap, but in the basic iteration of the system, the core of this narrows the opportunities for player agency, because your effective choice is you hit the cap, and then you can't do anything the rest of your time. And this inflection point is the point where your theorycraft knowledge and your personal preference in how to itemize stops mattering. For example, I can no longer ask the question, hey, I'm at the resistance cap and I have rarity as a suffix on one of my rings, but I'm about to go and fight some boss that deals majority lightning damage. Would I rather add some additional lightning survivability instead of having that item rarity? Additionally, I can't ask questions like, hey, it's early 0.3 and Abyss Ignites are super overtuned. Can I just push my fire res up and up and up and up and up in order to deal with that until eventually the community team reads my forum post or my Reddit comment or my YouTube comment or watches a Crimson YouTube video and adjusts that by telling the balance team to fix the Abyss Ignites. So I don't like that. I don't like the hard cap. I don't like the existence of the soft cap. And I don't like that you have to rely on obscure mechanics or mechanics that are locked behind ascendancies in order to get beyond that. Although I certainly have the knowledge to do so, I think that it makes the game less accessible, and I think it reduces player agency and build design, in addition to making Zaki's job, especially during early portions of the leveling, literally impossible. So what's the actual good system? And the good system is to rely on a more complicated rating system for resistances, similar to what's actually used for armor in PoE2, though the armor formula is bad for a whole other reason. So what you could do is you could have your damage reduction multiplier as a function of your resistance not give you resistance percentage directly, though it would still show as a resistance percentage tooltip in your menu, so that way players who are used to looking at a percentage have the opportunity to do it, and the tooltip would explain how the conversion works. So that way no one's confused. We're not going to confuse the new player. The tooltips explain everything, and the stats menu still reads the same thing that it does now. But we actually give players more agency once they cross a slightly larger knowledge gap in order to do things much better. And that's to create a system that relies on this formula, where your damage reduction multiplier as a function of your, say, fire resistance rating is equal to 1 minus 0.03 times your fire resistance rating divided by 1 plus 0.03 times the absolute value of your fire resistance rating. The reason that I choose 0.03 is because then every additional 1 point in fire resistance rating would result in 3% increased effective HP against fire damage, right? So you can see that here you get, in these graphs that we already have, you get accelerating returns. It goes up and up and up more and more steeply. Your effective HP does as a consequence of more and more investment in resistance until you hit a cap, and then you just get nothing. And here, the effective HP is a function of your investment. Your fire damage multiplier would go from taking all of the hit to taking a dramatically reduced amount. But your actual effective HP as a function of investment would scale purely linearly, without any investment, without any diminishing returns. Naturally, this results in it being much easier for people to estimate the amount of, say, fire resistance max hit that you have, and therefore it's easier to balance fights because it compresses the multiplicative difference between the best and worst players' effective HP, which means that other aspects of your build and survivability are more relevant. Having a good flask is more relevant. Having the ability to dodge hits is more relevant, while maintaining player agency deeper into the endgame in terms of how you can invest in resistances, because if you want, you can continue to stack your fire effective max hit as large as you'd like. This, of course, is a linear growth in your effective HP. I want to make this point. You cannot, through this system, although it is possible to continue linearly growing the size of your fire max hit, I want to make the point, this does have diminishing returns because the percentage increase in your effective HP goes down. The difference between 100 EHP and 106 EHP is 6%. The difference between 400 EHP and 406 EHP is 1.5%. So you end up tapering off such that your effective HP percentage growth falls off in the endgame, but you still have the opportunity to invest more if that's your choice, without ever creating a balance problem where you can't, as the game designer, predict the amount of fire max hit that the player has, and therefore you can't make the Jamunra fight engaging for all players, or make the Arbiter fight engaging for all players, or make the Zesht fight engaging for all players. The other nice thing about this shape of formula is that if you want the rating system to be equivalent to what it is now, where you want 75% resistance to be the normal amount, the player now knows that 100 fire resistance rating points is equal to 75% resistance, the current cap. So when you show them their fire resistance rating, it's a clean number to correspond to the expected value in endgame, and players can overcap beyond that while still having a clean reference value. You could also change this number, by the way. I just want to point that out. You can change this number if you want, and you can have this number be some value that makes it so that 75 rating is equal to the current 75%. That's trivial to do. It's not hard. You could just change that number to 0.0225, and that would be the exact same thing that we currently have now. So in any case, Zaki's job is extremely hard, and that's because resistances are extremely poorly designed. And if you change from the sort of system that we have now, which gives additive reductions in your percentage resistance, to one that gives multiplicative reductions in your percentage resistances, it compresses the difference between the best and worst EHP case while still maintaining a substantive advantage for having good items, which maintains the relevancy of player skill during combat and makes the campaign and early maps more engaging. The same system extended a little bit to a slightly more complicated formula, like this one, gives you the opportunity to extend that same concept into the endgame, where players who want to invalidate content defensively are not able to become immortal, but are able to make itemization choices that make offense not the only way for you to scale your build in the endgame. So this means that you're able to balance things out during the campaign to make it more engaging, and you're able to give players more tools to create more interesting defensive builds in the endgame without becoming immortal. This would require a pretty substantive overhaul of the defensive ethos of PoE 2, but there are other games that use formulas like this. To use a mass market and extremely successful example, Defense of the Ancients 2, Dota 2, the MOBA, uses a physical damage reduction system that works almost exactly like this. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.